I'm Marion Self. I'm an agronomist for Prime Agriculture and I'm based in Suffolk.
I'm Andrew Ward, farmer at Glebe Farm, Leadenham in Lincolnshire.
So the rust risk, I think, has diminished a little bit over winter because it's been so cold, but we need to remember the amount of variety susceptible to rust that's actually in the ground. Varieties like Oakley and Viscount and Solstice taking up a big area of the cropping of the wheat crop. So consecutive cold days and nights really will have helped reduce the rust infection, but we don't need much inoculum in the spring when it gets warm for the infection to get going again, so we do need to take precautions in that way. So I think actually that T0 is going to be an essential thing to think about on a lot of rust-prone varieties this season. So yes, I mean I would suggest a cost-effective mix of triazoles or a sort of relatively cheap triazole just to keep out rust, but we mustn't forget Septoria as well at the moment.
Well, in the past I've used Cherokee as a sort of cheapish T0 to help to start the plant off well into the spring, and I was thinking about the same again this time, but of course you've got the issue of chlorothalonil with that if you're looking at mixing it with anything else to think about. Would that be okay, or would I ought to be better off with some other straight triazole without the chlorothalonil mixture?
Yeah, so a mixture of triazoles with a little bit of chlorothalonil, great start in terms of broad spectrum disease control for rust and Septoria there. In terms of Atlantis mixing, well, I think that if you've got serious blackgrass, high population or resistant issues, then I think it is important to try and split that application away from the Atlantis to get the most you can out of Atlantis.
Yeah, good. What I was thinking about with the T1 as well, what would be the best product to use? Obviously we have Septoria to think about as well with these varieties, with rust as well as another issue. I always like to use a strobilurin where possible. What would you tend to use in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about particularly, we have been worried about rusts and maybe thinking about the spend on rust varieties and perhaps moving the triazole this season. When we were more worried about rust before the cold, then there was consideration of moving the strobe perhaps to a T1 position and take the protectant benefits of the strobe in that situation. Now we've been in such a cold period for so long, I think that I personally will stick to a strobe at T2 and T3, but I would definitely be using a robust T0 to start the programme off well, and T1s as well. Yeah,
well, that's my situation where I've normally used the strobe is at the last two timings. So when we get to the sort of the flag leaf timing, obviously that's where the most yield is gained from a good fungicide programme. What would you sort of recommend again with Oakley in that situation? Obviously it depends on what we put on the first timings and how robust those treatments were.
Yeah, it's all about good fungicide timing and keeping those timings tight between treatments, but for a T2 flagleaf spray I think you're looking at putting a bit of strobe in there. I particularly like pyraclostrobe in a disease.
That's normally what I use, pyraclo with Opus.
There are obviously other choices, and with a bit of chlorothalonil and keeping your triazole up again. Keeping it fairly simple really.
Good. Okay. Yeah, obviously T3s is another issue we've got to consider, but we'll obviously leave that till later on in the season until we decide how the crop potential is and things. With regard costings of programmes and percentages of each application, obviously we need to sort of take that into account when we're looking at disease programmes. Where do you say we need to be on percentages of a total programme cost, sort of with a T0, T1 and 3 and 2 and that sort of thing?
Okay, Andy. Well, in terms of the fungicide costs of the entire programme, I mean there's going to be some variability there between date of drilling and variety, but I think generally as an average cost you're sort of talking about £85 a hectare, maybe going up higher on some situations.
Right.
So how would that cost be split across the programme?
Yes, across all three.
Yeah, I mean I think you're really looking perhaps in this season where perhaps we've beefed up the T0 a little bit. I think we're talking about 9% perhaps costs at T0, roughly 30-31% on T1s, sort of 37ish I guess on T2 flagleaf, and then the remainder on sort of on T3.
On T3s.
Yeah, I mean what we thought maybe with the with the rust season that we thought we might have had before the really cold snap, that proportion might have changed. It might have shifted a little bit to a little bit more spend at T0, even more spend at T0, a little bit more spend at T1, and shifted that away. But I think what I've just said is probably what's going to happen.
Oh, well, that's useful now. I think because where we've been around the 80s, £85 a hectare the last year or two, and obviously still growing Oakley, and Oakley resistance has lowered on the yellow rust this last year. But I still think it's a variety that we need to keep growing because of its returns from it, with the control we can get from some of these fungicides, with rust.
Exactly right, Andy. I mean, even without the yellow rust risk, we know that Oakley is also very susceptible to septoria. We mustn't overlook that this season, and we know that it's a very responsive variety, high yielding variety, and it responds to inputs. Let's go all out for yield here.
Right, well, thanks, Marion. That's been a big help. Thank you.
Okay.